If you are watching this, you are here for day 2 of watercolor techniques. You should already have this completed. If you didn't, you should pause the video and go watch day 1 of watercolor techniques so that you can get this complete. Another thing we did with day 1 is we filled out our sketchbook this far. If you have not done that, like I said, go watch the video. But we're going to keep on moving. The greatest thing about watercolor is it's all about layering. So I'm going to get rid of this image. And we're going to start layering on this from here on out. Wet on wet techniques were important to start with because they're going to give us a nice coverage and have some really beautiful designs. So you can see this was wet on wet, and that turned out, now it's all dry. Now everything's all dry on here. I can now start layering more on and cleaning things up. The wet on wet techniques don't give you a lot of control, but these next couple will let you kind of control a little bit more. So I'm going to start with all my wet on wet and giving it a base coat on pretty much everything. This was the blended, this was the wet on wet, this was the saran wrap. You can see how mine turned out, looks really nice. And then up here I can get rid of any salt, and that looks really good too. It's got that really cool texture going on there. Okay, so on our sketchbook we have another big category, which is wet on dry, and we're going to do a few subcategories underneath that, but I want to make sure that this is something that stands out to me, like wet on wet. So I'm going to use this and make that stand out. So what this is just like wet on wet. It's a wet paintbrush on dry paper. So wet paintbrush on dry paper. Okay, and our first wet on dry is going to be a wash. So this stands out, a wash. Key vocab term. And you'll do a lot of washes on your project because it's basically just like using a pencil or a pen or something like that. So it's going to be a lighter color, lighter watercolor, so meaning lots of water. And it's also going to be like using a pencil. Okay, so if you need to pause and write all that information in your sketchbook, do so. But I'm just going to grab my colors here. And I already have a plate. On day 1, we started mixing on our plate, so I already have some here. So I actually might use these colors and mix them a little bit and make some muted colors to make my wash. So I'm taking water and I'm going to hydrate some of these colors back up. That looks kind of too bright so I'm bringing some purple in, and that's a nice muted color for my leaf. So I'm just going to take this paintbrush and I'm going to do a wash over everything. And that's a little dark, but not too bad. I'm just using it like a pencil. I'm just covering the areas that I want to be that color. There, that's getting a little lighter, which is nice. And I'm just doing a quick wash over all the things that I will eventually use. And luckily, since we let this paper dry, we can just paint right on it and we don't have to worry about this wet on wet technique barging in and taking over our colors, and we were able to just kind of layer over whatever we might want to. So I layered right over top of this and it didn't matter. So I did a quick wash over all the things, like so. And now I'm going to move on. So I'm going to bring my notes back over. And my next one is going to be layer. Key vocab term. This is going to be the details. You can add in details. You can clean things up. Let's put up here that this was the plant. The plant is what we're doing the wet on dry on. Okay, and so we're also going to layer some details and clean up parts. Okay, so this might be on our plant pot. Okay, so pause the video, finish the notes. I'm going to move this off to the side. So if I'm going to layer on this plant pot, you can see it's got like this really jagged, not very clean, kind of gross edge over here. So I'm going to take some of the color that I've got on there. You could use a different color if you wanted to, but I'm going to do a wash or a layer on top of it. They're both kind of the same. I want it to be pretty light. Okay, so I'm taking my paint here, and I'm going to take some of that blue, okay, and I'm just going to, right next to here, clean up this edge. So all I'm doing is making a nice crisp edge over there so that it's cleaned up. I'm going to take a little bit more of, oh, there we go. A little darker would be better. Just right along that edge. And then I'm going to wash out my paintbrush, and I'm going to take just water and I'm going to drag it over like this so that it kind of smooths it out for you. So anywhere where you might want to clean up an edge, you could do a layer over top. I could also do a layer back here, like my cast shadow, because I'm starting to layer up my watercolors. That's what watercolor is all about. You want to layer your colors. Okay, so I'm going to use, I'm going to actually make a black over here, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to grab some of this darker blue, bring it over here, and then I'm going to wash out my paintbrush and grab some orange. Because these are opposite on the color wheel, they're going to make a brown for sure. But if I use not very much orange at all and just start mixing this in slowly, it will eventually get a little bit more black. Well, maybe I need more orange than I thought. There it is. See how that's starting to turn black? You want a lot more blue and a little bit of orange. And if I keep going towards the orange, it's going to make it really brown. But if I stay more on the blue side, it's going to be more black. So I've got a nice black here that I can make a cast shadow. And I'm just layering right over top of this with a wash. You can still see the red or the red that we painted originally in there, and that creates depth. Okay, so those are two ways of putting wet on dry. Another wet on dry technique is isopropyl. Isopropyl, can't say that. It's just basically a rubbing alcohol, and it's going to be sort of the same as salt. So I'll show you how to do that. We're going to pick one of our leaves and do that to it. So isopropyl, we're going to put it on a leaf, and it acts as a absorbent. Oh. Okay, so on one of my leaves, I'm going to paint my color. I'm going a little darker this time since I'm layering it up. And I'm just going to paint maybe a little darker than that. There we go. Painting a wash right over top of it. And then I'm going to take my isopropyl and dip a Q-tip into it like that. And when I press that in, it's just absorbing all of that. I don't know if you can see very well, but I'll just keep going so you can. Now it's starting to grab the paint in those areas. You can see it's going to make a really interesting texture. So I just kind of dotted a little bit on there, and we will see when it's dry what that looks like, but I actually have an example already, and that's the texture it makes. So if you wanted a sort of bubbly texture, this would be a great technique to use. So we'll see what that looks like later. Okay, we have one final detail, and obviously it's a big category, so this is going to be dry on dry. Dry paintbrush on dry paper, and we're going to do this on a leaf. Okay, take those notes. If you need to pause, pause. Okay, so I've got a dry paper. I know I added some paint today on this, but when I touch the paper, it's dry. It's not wet. It dries pretty quickly. But I'm going to take one of my paint brushes and I'm going to completely dry it off with a paper towel. Then I'm going to take a paint. I want it to be a dark paint, so I've got some already on my plate. I hope this works. And I'm going to just kind of fan out my paintbrush like this, and I'm going to dip it into the paint. And after I dip it, I'm going to fan it out again. And this is just going to create, yeah, it's doing it, but I think I need a darker color. You can see the texture a little bit. I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see the texture starting to happen, but I think I need a darker pigment for this. Okay, dry off my paintbrush, dip it in my paint, fan it out, and then I'm starting to see a texture. When would I use something like this? Probably on grass or the texture of clothes or fur of an animal or things like that. This is going to be the final step. Once you're doing dry on dry, you really shouldn't go back in too much with any other watercolor. Maybe, possibly, a little bit of a layer. Like if I wanted to clean up this edge right here, I could possibly come back in and clean that up a little bit more. But you really want to keep the texture. That's the point of it. So, but another great thing about wet on dry is you could go back in and put some of those cool details that you know are there on that image. So see, if I did that, I actually got rid of all those cool details that I had. So I'm kind of bummed about that, but that's okay. I could always wait for this to dry and layer on top of it again. So those are our day 2 watercolor techniques. I want you to try them out on these. But watercolor, like I said, is all about layering. So on my image, I'm going to be thinking about how I could use these. Obviously, I have wet on wet back here. I have isopropyl, which makes the moon look kind of like cheese. On this one, I did saran wrap, so it's got a cool texture on there. I could probably put salt somewhere. I actually did a nice layer of black here, and then I went back in with a wash or a layer right here and maybe blended it out. So some of these kind of go together, and you can kind of use these techniques to start building up and cleaning up your layer. This one right here, I did a layer of wet on dry, and then I just took water and spread it down so it kind of blends together. So as you work within your work of art, you'll see areas where you can use these techniques. At the very end, in your sketchbook, you are going to glue this right next to this so you can kind of see those techniques happening together.